Thank you for having me. This particular session is designed just to kind of give you an overview of some of the things that we've been doing at ICCIT, a few things borrowed from when I was at DePaul University before this, and to think about the affordances of different technology and spaces. And so some of the affordances stuff maybe you can apply to a wide variety of tech, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for any Q&A about any of the AR or VR, I was going to say tools, technology, hardware, software that we've been trying to use to teach people things. All right. I wanted to go over some terms quickly. Come in. I wanted to go over some terms. You know, this audience probably knows some of these, but just so we're all on the same page. So first is the idea of virtual reality, because you probably have heard a lot more than you ever wanted to about the metaverse this year. Yes? Right? And one of my interesting things, since we've talked so much about large language models and AI today as well, is that there have been a rash of tech articles saying, Zuckerberg is backing away from the metaverse and investing in AI. And I'm like, those things go together, right? If you want avatars that speak to you and generative spaces, then maybe those things are tied together. But when we think of virtual reality, we think about getting in a headset and being in an immersive space where we're transported to somewhere else. So in the little slides, we have there's a game that we use a lot in demos, Beat Saber, and then there's Virtual Me teaching a class at DePaul, and that's an immersive virtual classroom. We are in that space. I have also done work in pedagogy and augmented reality. And so when we think about augmented reality, this is about digital overlays on the physical world. We've got some Magic Leap glasses there. We've got, probably the most famous AR game, which is Pokemon Go, and I think they're coming out with virtual pets. Like, there was an announcement last week, and I'm sure my 10-year-old just got a phone for his birthday, and the first thing he did was like download Pokemon Go, and I'm a little upset with him because he didn't talk to me, and so he picked the wrong team, and now we're on different teams. And another term I want to bring up today is the idea of affordances. And so many of you are coming from the engineering space. I'm sure you're familiar with the design of everyday things and thinking through affordances of objects. You know, the example of the affordances of a chair, et cetera. Good, I'm seeing lots of nods. When I came to the idea of affordances, it was thinking about social media and the affordances of a technology. And so we think a little bit less about what are all the buttons of something, but how does the design of a particular technology allow for particular kinds of communication? And then when we think about instructional technology and instructional communication, these things start to tie together in the way that we can deliver particular lessons via technology. And so we've got a definition up there. I like it because I wrote it. But we've got a definition up there, right? And it's that affordances aren't the chair itself, right? And they aren't the outcome of what you're doing, but it is the relationship that you have with that object. And so social norms go into that a bit. What you want to accomplish with that goes into a bit, and the way that you perceive technologies around you go into that as well. So to get into some of my experiences, I started wandering, I guess not away from social media, but I was doing social media research, and I started wandering towards AR and VR, in that when I was at DePaul University, they run their first year experience classes a little different than anywhere else I've been, which is that they make you compete to teach them, right? And the first year experience class, which is often a lot of like how to use the library and that sort of thing, a lot of faculty are like, that is not what I got in this job to do. But at DePaul, you could propose any topic you wanted, and then you got like a sophomore or a junior who taught like how to build your schedule, how to go to the library. And the whole thing was you had to teach a way for students to get introduced to the city of Chicago in an immersion week before school started through a lens that you wanted. So there was a lot of Chicagoan food. There was oddly 2 Death in Chicago classes. There was Chicago theater. And there was starting to be enough augmented reality experiences within the city that I thought, what if we put together an augmented Chicago course? And so I spent several years teaching this course before COVID. So my life is sort of divided into like pre-COVID, in whatever stage of COVID we are in now, but also like being at DePaul and then coming here at 2021. So it's like before COVID, I was here in Chicago, and now I'm in Toronto. But we did a lot of different things in that week. And so you can kind of see in some of these pictures, the one with the tree in it, that's the Eastland disaster. And you go, and the students can actually, the Chicago History Museum has put it together. You go and you line up your phone, and the students can actually see, what happened when the Eastland sunk in that particular spot. There's all sorts of pictures and imaging. And you will have people wander by, and they'll look at my students, and I know they're thinking like, kids on their phones. And they are, but they're experiencing this historical application as well. Bundle AR, which is a Chicago-based company, has a Harold Washington, who was the first black mayor of Chicago, exhibit. And so you can see Emma there holding her picture with a Harold Washington that's not really there. We played Pokemon Go, right? We did statue stories, all of these things. But through that, right, it wasn't just about going out and, playing AR games. In fact, when I submitted my application, the committee and the revision process were like, so are we just playing Pokemon Go all week? And I was like, did not read it, no. But it is about how do you weave in the lessons you want to weave in. And so for us at DePaul, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion. So we talked a lot about digital divides. What kinds of access to technology do we have? What kinds of we don't? The whole point is to learn about Chicago. So we started taking on this theme of Chicago as layers anyway, right? The layers of history, what happened after the fire, what buildings could have been. And so we think about that place as what does it mean to be in a place, and what does it mean to add something to a place, and what does it mean to layer these things together. We talk about contested definitions, because I started you out with a definition of VR and AR, but not everybody agrees on what those definitions are. We go to 1871, and we let some of the companies there argue about what augmented reality is and immersive spaces. And all of these things sort of go together. And this was great. We were having a great time. It was a great class. I really enjoyed taking the students around Chicago. And then COVID happened. And so in the spring, as we're shutting everything down at DePaul and moving our entire spring semester online, there was a thought of like, what will happen in the fall when we want to do these tours and we're bringing the students in, only they're not going to be here because we're not going to get them here. They're going to be all over the country. We're not going to all jam-pack ourselves onto the red line. Like, what are we going to do? And everyone in these meetings for Discover kept turning to me and going, well, you'll be fine, because your class is about technology. And I went, the affordances of AR are such that we have to be in a particular place. We have to be there at the Eastland disaster. We could all play Pokemon somewhere, somewhere else, but it's not the same experience. So what are we going to do? So we asked the university for a bunch of money, because this is most of my life these days. And we actually got 27 headsets, and we shipped them across the country. And I drove around Chicago and dropped off headsets, and I was like the only professor these students saw this semester, and their parents saw me too. So I had like my little DePaul shirt and everything, and they're like, are you a professor? And I'm like, yes, here's a VR headset, see you online. And so we had this classroom, we didn't build it. We used an HTC Vive Sync classroom, and those are the students from that year and their avatars. And we tried to see, could you replicate a classroom experience in a VR setting? In a VR setting. And we learned some things. One is you can, and there are, the simpler the interface is, the better. We also learned some things about avatars. For example, in this class, they talked a lot about that you can only choose like one size person, and we're not all the same size. And the students did talk about, the clothing options that were available. Interestingly enough, you can see some of the guys are dressed in like suits. And I have never had a first-year student come to class in a suit. And so I asked them, I was like, why suits? They're like, well, we felt like it was class, and maybe we should be a little more professional. I love 18-year-olds, right? But this group, too, they had never experienced a college classroom. They could only compare Zoom and VR. But it allowed us to have a sense of place, because we did some Zoom things as well, right? I didn't start them in VR. It allowed us to have a sense of place. There's screens here, so you can run like a regular PowerPoint. We did joke about all this technology, and here's a PowerPoint, right? So sometimes you have to think through the affordances. I taught part of my communication and technology graduate seminar in here. In this class now, I had a non-binary student, and I emailed them before the class started, and I said, I hate to do this to you. I want to know up front what I can do to help this situation, but the avatar choice is going to ask you immediately if you want to be male or female. And they're now working on it, but because we had a good relationship with the HTC team who built this classroom, and I was like, here's the problem, guys. They were all guys. And so the student in question, they found kind of a blend. It was actually kind of interesting that worked for them, and they were appreciative that I had brought it up, but that's an issue within these spaces as well that you don't always think about, like what are the options available for your avatar, et cetera. We found that the space worked really well for presentations. Again, oddly, we're now doing PowerPoint within the VR class. We didn't do as well in like seminar, right? Like having a discussion, which I was really excited about. Part of the reason we didn't do as well in seminar was because of the sound system of this particular VR classroom. And so people have to mute and unmute, and you can hear everybody at once. And if everybody's headset is on, it blows out your ears, right, with the feedback. And so there are different spaces that work better, but that's another kind of affordance to think about is, does it have spatial audio? Can you send them away? We use a classroom called Engage right now, where you can put people in this space called the Avebury Henge, and you can just send them walking away, and they can just kind of transport themselves away, and you can't hear them. And then with a click of a button, you can bring them all back, which is convenient. And so, like I said, I have my before life and my afterlife. So in the afterlife, that's not right. But in the afterlife, all right, here we are, U of T, heaven. Coming here to the Institute at ICCIT, I started teaching a course that had been on the books. Rhonda McEwan had been teaching it, actually. So we just swapped out one McEwan for another and started teaching Affordances and an experiential learning class, because Rhonda had originally designed this class to be experiential learning, and it was virtual environments. So previously, the class had all been very PC-based, and when I came in with a bunch of startup funds and said, let's buy headsets, and let's put them in headsets, and we have kind of built our collection over time that we have in the CCT building. So that got me thinking more about what is experiential education? Right? And I know we probably all know the definition, the basic definition of experiential education, but why virtual environments in a VE class? And it was still, the first semester I was teaching it, we were still at home a lot, so I wasn't going to be taking them out to different like VR companies. It wasn't going to be experiential in that way. And so when you think about the kind of the basics of experiential education, it's that the learner's directly in touch with what they are studying. And you have this cycle, right, of I'm thinking about something, right? So we do some in-class stuff at the beginning of this semester. We're thinking about things, we think about affordances, we think about theories, we think about what are the possibilities in virtual environments, we think about cultural imagination in virtual environments, and then we get them into spaces. And I use a variety of spaces. I'm happy to answer questions on things that I have used that have worked and have not. I do have a joke that every time I say and commit to that I'm going to use a particular space, they pull the support for it. Thank you, Microsoft, for alt spaces, and Mozilla for hubs, and all those good things. But because it's an emerging field, right? And so it's going to be a great picture. And then we experience it, and then we reflect on it, and we do this through writing assignments that I'm now rethinking as we go as well. But we do a lot of things within headset, but we also use a lot of PC-based things. So we think about learning and design by playing Guild Wars, right? They read an article that's based on learning and design, and then we go through the first few stages of that particular game. So that's not in headset, but because it teaches you how to play the game, right? And so we ask them to focus on those things instead of just running through the game, and then they start to realize, like, oh yeah, the design of a space can help me think through these issues. So this brings me to the idea of, in terms of pedagogy, what are the affordances that might be the most useful for learning outcomes within virtual reality? And because we've published work in the past on affordances and measuring affordances in social media space, it is these sort of perceived communication affordances, and there's a variety that I think might apply to VR, and this is part of what we're working on in the research in my lab as well right now. And so the other thing about affordances as we think of them is they have to be on a continuum. So it's not usually that a technology has it or doesn't have it, but it has it more or less. And so if we think about immersivity, the immersion, how much does the real world, I don't like to say real, physical, right? It's all real, but how much does the physical world fade away to the digital world? You may feel more immersed in a headset than you do in a pancake media virtual environment that when we're playing Guild Wars than you do in an AR situation. Presence is often billed as like the affordance for VR, right? That's why it's better than Zoom. I say better, tongue in cheek, right? That's why it's necessarily better in Zoom. That's why it's better than text messaging or emailing, et cetera, because we're gonna have all this presence. But I don't necessarily think the industry has really thought through what presence is. And the fact that we've been able to measure presence in text messaging and found that actually you can feel quite present, right? You can feel like the other person's really there with you. And so it's really gonna depend on what kind of presence. There's also been a little work here and there. A colleague of mine, Chris Nowak at University of Connecticut, was working on a study and they were looking at learning outcomes and presence in VR. And they didn't get an effect for presence on any of their learning outcomes. So more work to be done, but we are starting to kind of eyeball that, like, oh, presence will make everything better finding, and say, maybe not. The idea of place, right? So that is something that VR does a little bit different than a video conferencing software, is the feeling that we are sharing a place, and that can help you with building classroom community, kind of like we did with the Discover students. It can help you with feeling like, oh yeah, I'm going to class in this headset instead of being on a screen. But again, does that do it better than a face-to-face situation? Well, maybe not, right? And so now you kind of have to think like, maybe this is better for distance learning instead of video conferencing. Persistence. Right now, a lot of VR has very low persistence. In fact, one of the struggles with VR classrooms is that there is not a functional way to take notes right now. And I have seen, that the new Apple product might be fixing all of that and we can just type in space, and I will be very, very excited for that. I have had Apple let me down for the last decade with their product announcements, right? So I am waiting. So in mid-June, I might be very excited if that's what they've come out with. But I have learned to take it with a grain of salt. We are starting to see more spaces where persistence can come into play. I saw an excellent thesis at OCAD this year where she had created a persistent space and family members could come in and leave things there. And I really liked that idea, and she used spatial to do that. And I liked that idea of having a spatial classroom where students could, within guidelines, maybe decorate it. We could have notes up. You could come back and forth. And then I think a lot about what students might write and with guidelines. Realism, right? Again, how real does it feel? How real does it not feel? It might be an affordance that you want for some things. If you're doing like clinical simulations, you might want it to feel very real. In other cases, the cartoon avatar might be okay, right? Or the cartoon kind of setting. They have a few out there now where you can, take a picture of yourself and create an avatar of that. I don't have an image of mine in this slide because I don't want to scare you. But one of my friends looked at it and she said, "What in the Rachel Dract?" And I don't really look like Rachel Dract, but that picture of me, it like pinned everything in this way. And I don't think that will help my students learn, right? If they're looking at this kind of image. The idea of creation, right? This is a potentially great affordance for virtual spaces. What if you could just get in and create things, right? You're in engineering, like what if you could build things and see how it's gonna work out without it, like having to deal with physical materials? If you had the physics in there, the mechanics in there. But this is actually not something that a lot of VR spaces do well, because all of that has to be coded every action you want to be able to take has to exist in the code, right? This is where the generative AI might become very interesting in these spaces, but it isn't there yet. And so it's a future possibility, but if it's not persistent, right? There's a lot of really fun art apps, but things tend to go away as soon as you close the app. Then we have to think about what are we doing? Interactivity, right? How interactive do you feel with people, which goes a lot with the idea of bandwidth, which for the way that we defined it in our measures, we use bandwidth both thinking of like the telecom kind of bandwidth and bandwidth the way nonverbal scholars think about bandwidth, which is how many cues can you get through in a single channel. So like text messaging, low bandwidth, face-to-face, very high bandwidth. VR is in the middle, right? You have voice, if you don't have to mute everyone. You have voice, but like lecturing in a VR classroom, even set up to be a lecture hall, is even a little bit more disconcerting than Zoom sometimes, because the avatars are there, but they're not doing anything. They don't have facial expressions, right? You guys are all giving me like great feedback right now, and I get a little bit of like the head nodding from students because the headset will pick it up. I get when they've walked away because their avatar does this. Right? Like, oh, you dropped your headset or something happened there, or you went to get a snack. But the feedback you'd get from a physical classroom, even when you're not doing a lot of interactive content, isn't quite there yet. But in different spaces, like if I have them interact in small groups and they are all able to unmute and talk to each other, that can be very useful and better than like a Zoom breakout kind of idea. So some of the kind of affordances to learning outcomes. So this is a quote from one of my DePaul students. Remember, these were 18-year-olds who had never been in a physical classroom. And so they're comparing to Zoom. And he says, I prefer having class this way due to the fact that now, as bad as it sounds, I am forced to actually pay attention. Also, these were honor students too, right? And so, but honor students, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, they're very good at thinking that they are paying attention to class, but they are also on their phone, and there's also other stuff going on in their house, and their parents maybe don't understand that now is class time, and they're not just like on their screen, right? And they also have a million tabs up, and they're online shopping, and da-da-da. In a face-to-face classroom, all my students have computers. I cannot see what is on their computers. They're not all paying attention to me, right, when we're doing research methods. Oh, so, okay. And so, the immersivity of the classroom, this quote was there, but time and time again, students have said, I have to be there, right? It does feel very immersive, and I know that at least I'm here. So we have also presence and place, right? Kind of coming together to feel that we're in the same room. And again, I think this is a comparison of where it might be very good for distance learning, because we already have presence and place in a face-to-face classroom. But if we're trying to get beyond the video conferencing classroom for like online by design kind of classes, then perhaps VR could be useful. And where I think it might be particularly useful is in realism when we're trying to do simulation. So during the pandemic, my husband was a nursing student. He's now a nurse. But all of his clinicals got canceled, right? Which has been a struggle then as a new nurse, because now he's doing clinicals first year on the job, really. And they had a lot of like, take this quiz, read this story, take this quiz kind of clinicals. But having something in VR might be even better than face-to-face because you can change the parameters a lot, right? And you can have lots of different situations happen. But the correspondence between virtual and external performance needs to be there, right? It needs to be the same motions, same movements. Let's see if I can get all these out here. And then some of the struggles within the technology can either facilitate or hinder the way that it works for education. So if we can interact easily, but if we have to stop and find the mute and unmute button and it's in a screen way up here instead of something right here, that can be difficult. If it's, I was saying, it can be difficult to tell nonverbals. And so all of those things could go together to make a great educational space. But if it's not there in the spaces that you're using, you have to think about how to work around that. So I know I'm almost out of time for questions, but that's kind of an overview of what we've been doing in ICCIT. We do sometimes do demos and lab tours. Lab tours a little bit aspirational because we're still working on building out the lab, but we do VR demos with the equipment, et cetera, that we've collected over time if you're interested in those things. Yes?
I have a question, which is, I am a queer grad student, so your point about can you represent yourself in a virtual space is interesting to me. Do you think that, obviously they're working on better representation avatars, but while that process is ongoing, do you think that it's better to just go abstract, real people, like instead of badly representing race or gender?
Yeah, so this is an interesting area to talk about, right? Because at first it was like, here's a selection of 6 hairstyles, and people were like, those are for white people, right? The hairstyle thing's a hardware issue as well, right? The headsets have gotten better, but the initial headsets were meant for people whose hair sits very flat to their head, that do not have a headdress on, right? And so all of those issues, all those biases were sort of baked into the technology because of who was working on the technology. And so they are getting better. The one that killed me was like an earlier VR, they really didn't accommodate glasses. And I was like, how did you guys miss glasses, right? But I think you're onto something that in terms of thinking about students and making sure that they're comfortable in spaces that you're using, yeah, having a lot of options is good. If everyone's sort of the, same kind of cartoony looking thing, like equally bad is an option as well. But it is nice to have like, I can be a robot. I liked using Mozilla Hubs when they still had support for it. It still exists, but it's buggier than it used to be because they don't support it anymore. Because you can be a robot, you can bring in an image, a cartoon image, and it's very cartoony, and it does feel a little weird to be teaching to a class of ducks and robots and penguins, but it works, right? And then the key also, I think, to VR spaces is picking one where the students' names appear above them. Learning names is really, really hard when you're in 6 different virtual environments and they change their name every time. But some students would pick an aesthetic. Like one guy always wore pink, and so I always knew it was him, and it was great. But having some variation there, I think, is useful. Sure.
The abstraction. I did some virtual teaching where people on Zoom could write on a whiteboard anonymously, and I found that helpful for math because the students weren't as nervous about presenting in front of class because nobody could tell it was them. So is there ever an option to kind of flip if you got a realistic character or a character people recognize to everybody's anonymous for a while to try to do something?
Yeah, it really would depend on the space that you're in. You could have everyone pick avatars. I'm thinking of Engage now, which we use a lot, and so you could have everyone pick avatars and they could just, choose a basic avatar and have a name that's, not there. They're starting to have persistent spaces as well. They have whiteboards within them, right? So people could draw out equations and all of that kind of thing. So it would just be a matter of picking the space that has the affordances you want to get to the outcome you want. Yeah.
Do you find that students are learning better in the virtual world, or?
So there's quite a bit of research on that, and I was being more experiential and talking about experiences. So with my particular course that's experiential learning, it's a little hard to say because we wouldn't learn it another way. I know that the other McEwan, right, Rhonda and her team, Michelle Louis, Michael Nixon, they've done some work on biology models and teaching students aspects of biology and anatomy, and actually have some pretty good outcomes of the ability to get in and physically manipulate anatomy does help you retain. Noak's work is a little bit more mixed, and I've also had the thought that she's in those studies, she's not teaching, she's a communication professor, right? And she's not teaching her expert content, right? And so when she's teaching about the brain or whatever physical implement that they have to use the 3D assets in that space, they're not finding that group presence is helping anything. But I think there's also a bunch of confounds happening as well. It is sort of still a really new space, so I think those are really interesting empirical questions that we can start to dig into as we go. Yes?
So it's a follow-up question, I guess, to yours. Did you have students who were really uncomfortable in that space? And did they tell you why that was the case?
In the hardware or the software?
In the software. Well, actually, in both.
In both? Okay. So when we hand out headsets, so we have made the choice at ICCIT that we give the students the headsets, they sign a rental agreement, and then we return them at the end of the semester. So we're not expecting students to buy the equipment. It's a huge professional accomplishment of mine that we have always gotten them back so far. And so the headset itself, though, there's always a concern that it can be heavy, and students sometimes will say they get nauseous. And so they have made a lot of changes in the Pico, which we use, the Quest 2. The Quest Pro is actually great, but super expensive. You can change the interpupillary distance. And once I teach them to do that, that helps a lot. The graduate students at DePaul, we had a fairly heavy headset. It was an HTC Focus, and we spent 3 hours in it one night, and we were all like, do not recommend, never again, right? Because we needed to get through, we ran out the battery life too. We needed to get through all these presentations, and even though we were just sitting there watching everyone's presentations, at the end we're like, we have learned, no more. So I try to keep them in no more than 45 minutes to an hour and think about the class that way. We think about what is going to make it easier, but at this time, I almost always ensure that there is a PC version of what we are doing. So if we go to Verbella, which is a team suite organizational kind of software, you can do that in a headset or you can do it on a PC. You can get to our Engage classroom through a PC. So I like for this class for students to try to be in the headset, but if something is not working, if the headset is glitched, if it isn't charged that day, if it isn't, the Wi-Fi is not able to support it, they can always get on the PC and do it that way. Because I do have that concern that if you are one of those people that you are just always nauseous and stereoscopic vision, I don't want that to keep you from engaging in the class. It may change in the future as the equipment gets better.
I think that's the end of the session. We're a bit over.
Sorry.
But it's okay. It was a delightful